The train pulled into Calver at 4:30, when the October light was already going amber and thin across the platform boards. She stepped down with one bag and a hat box, and she stood for a moment at the edge of the platform while the other passengers moved around her like water around a stone. She was not lost. She was simply locating herself, taking the measure of the place before the place took the measure of her. Calver was the kind of town that fit in a single glance. Main Street, 2 blocks. A general store with a flour barrel tipped against the doorframe. A livery at the far end where a boy was sweeping dust that would just blow back. A church with a bell tower and no bell. The mountains sat behind all of it, blue and enormous, indifferent to whatever arrangements were being made below. She had been looking at the description of Calver for 6 weeks, reading the 2 paragraphs in the letter until the paper had softened at the folds. Small but settled. Good water. The boys are 7 and 9, and they are good boys, but they've gone quiet since their mother. That was how he had put it. Gone quiet. She adjusted the hat box to her other hand. There was a man standing at the end of the platform. He was not quite tall, but he was square-built, the kind of solid that comes from years of actual work rather than intention. He wore a gray coat that had been brushed recently. She could see the care in it. He was holding his hat in both hands and watching her without pretending not to. She walked toward him because there was no reason not to. He said her name once as a question. She said yes. He nodded and reached for her bag before she could indicate whether she wanted him to have it. She let him take it. He said the wagon was on the side street and that it was a 20-minute ride out to the property. She said that was fine. That was the whole of it. She followed him off the platform, and she was aware, without turning around, of 2 women standing outside the general store who had stopped their conversation. She did not turn around. She kept her chin level and her eyes on the wagon ahead. He put her bag in the back with the kind of care that suggested he'd thought about where to put it before she arrived. The hat box he waited on, and when she set it in herself, he made no comment. They rode out of Calver as the light dropped further, the road cutting through scrub and dry grass, the mountains ahead now purple at their edges. Neither of them spoke for the first several minutes. It was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people who understood that words, used too soon, could ruin the shape of something that hadn't formed yet. The property came into view just as the last light left the peaks. The house was not what she'd expected. She hadn't let herself form a clear expectation, but the house resolved that discipline anyway. It was neither large nor broken down. 2 stories, unpainted wood gone silver in the weather. A porch that ran the full front with a single rocking chair pushed against the rail. A light burned in the downstairs window. Someone had left it for them. He pulled the wagon around to the side, and she climbed down before he could come around to help her. Not proudly, just practically. The ground was dry, and the air had gone cool with the altitude, and she could hear, from somewhere behind the property, the sound of water over rock. He carried her bag to the porch. She carried the hat box. The front door opened before they reached it. A boy stood in the frame, 8 years old, perhaps 9. Dark hair pushed back from a face that had not been washed after supper. He looked at her the way children look at something they've been waiting on long enough to have formed a complete picture of, and now had to revise. She looked back at him without adjustment. She did not soften her expression into something welcoming. She simply looked, the way you look at something real. He said nothing about the boy. The boy said nothing about her. That was how it sat. Inside, the house had the order of a place managed by someone with a system, but no time to tend it past the necessary. The kitchen table was clear. The dishes from supper, she noticed, had already been cleaned and stacked. 3 plates, 3 cups, the third one being the boy's, smaller than the others. There was a pot on the stove that had been rinsed but not scrubbed, a lamp on the sideboard, a braided rug in front of the sink that had been placed with care and then walked on enough to shift sideways. She stood in the kitchen and took it in without comment. He showed her the room at the top of the stairs, a window that faced east, a quilt folded at the foot of the bed, a basin and a pitcher on the dresser. Clean, plain, left in the condition of someone who had done their best. She set the hat box on the dresser. She looked at the window. Outside it was full dark now, and the glass gave back the room instead of the land. He said he'd be up early. She said she would too. He went back down the stairs, and she heard the boy's voice, low, asking something she couldn't make out. She heard the answer, shorter still. She unpacked what she needed for the night and left the rest. She sat on the edge of the bed with her hands in her lap for a moment that was not long and not short. Then she went to the window and looked out at the dark she'd ridden into. She woke before the sky had color. The room was cold in the way of houses that have been heated at the edges for years, without enough people in them to hold the warmth. She dressed in the dark, by feel, and took her shawl from the post at the foot of the bed and went to the window. The land was coming back out of the black slowly, the ridgeline first, then the nearer shapes. A fence, a lean-to, the dark bulk of the barn, with one of its doors open at an angle. She went downstairs. The kitchen was empty, but the stove had been started. Not recently. The iron was fully warm, meaning he had come through before she woke, and built the fire, and left again without sound. She stood at the stove with her hands near the surface and let that fact settle without examining it. She found the flour sack, the salt, a crock of lard and a half-wheel of hard cheese on the shelf above the window, dried beans in a clay jar, a rope of onions hanging from a nail. She began to understand what kind of house this was. It had what it needed. Nothing arranged for comfort, only for use. She put water on and found the pan and started the biscuits. The boy appeared in the doorway before she had finished cutting them. He stood in his socks on the cold floor with his suspenders hanging, and looked at her with the careful stillness of a child who has learned not to ask for things. She did not turn around right away. She finished pressing the last biscuit and set it in the pan, and then she turned and looked at him. He was perhaps 8, brown-haired and pale from the winter. His face had the particular hollowness of a child who has been sad for long enough that it had stopped being an event and started being a condition. She said, "There's a hook by the door for your coat." He looked at the hook, then back at her. She turned and slid the pan into the oven. He came in and sat at the table without being told to. She could hear him behind her, the small sounds of him settling. His palms flat on the tabletop, his feet not quite reaching the floor. She sliced the cheese into a cloth and set out 2 cups and then a third without pausing between them. He watched all of this. She went to the window and checked the angle of the light and judged the biscuits would be ready before the man came in from the barn. They were. She heard the door and then his boots on the step, and then the particular silence of a man who has walked into something he didn't expect and is choosing not to name it. The boy looked up. She set the pan on the table. The man stood in the doorway long enough that the cold came in around him. She did not look up. She set the biscuits at the center of the table and pulled back her chair and sat. The boy had not moved. His hands were still flat on the wood. The man's eyes went from the pan to the boy to the woman, and then back to the pan, and whatever calculation he was running behind his face, he did not share. He came in and closed the door. He hung his coat on the second hook, the one below hers, and she noticed he did it without pausing to decide whether he should. He pulled out his chair, the chair at the head of the table, the one that had always been his, and sat down, and for a moment the three of them were arranged around the meal, and the silence was the same silence she had walked into the day before. Heavy, old, the kind of silence that has been rehearsed so many times it feels like furniture. She picked up the knife and cut one biscuit open. Steam lifted off the inside. She buttered it and set it on the boy's plate, and he looked at it the way children look at things they want but are not certain they are allowed to want. She cut a second one and set it on the man's plate and then her own. The butter dish was in the middle of the table. She moved it an inch closer to him. That was all. He picked up his fork. He did not say grace, and she did not prompt it. The boy watched his father and then reached for his own fork with the particular carefulness of a child mirroring a thing he has seen but is not practiced at. They ate. Outside, the wind had picked up. It moved against the east wall, and the candle on the shelf shifted without going out. She had found the candle that morning on the windowsill, a stub, nearly gone, held in a dented tin holder. She had moved it to the shelf without asking why it was on the sill. Some things in a house have their positions for reasons that do not survive explanation. Halfway through the meal, the boy said, "These are good." His voice came out smaller than he seemed to intend. He looked at the biscuit in his hand, and then at the table and not at her. She said, "There's honey in the cupboard if you want it." He thought about this. Then he looked at his father. The man had not stopped eating. He had not stiffened or looked up. He simply reached for his cup and drank and set it back down. And that stillness, that simple continuation, was apparently enough, because the boy pushed back his chair and went to the cupboard and found the jar himself. The boy brought the jar back to the table and set it down between them. He did not ask for a spoon. He worked the lid with both hands, his tongue pressed to his teeth, and when the seal broke, he looked up as though waiting for someone to comment. No one did. He dipped his biscuit and ate. She kept her eyes on her plate. There was a quality to the silence now that was different from the silence before the meal. Earlier, it had been the silence of people who did not know what to do with each other. This was something else. The silence of a table where eating is happening, which is its own kind of order, its own kind of peace. She had known tables like that as a girl. She had not known one in some years. When the man finished, he set his fork down and pushed his plate a few inches toward the center of the table. A small, unconscious gesture, the kind a person does not know they learned. He did not stand immediately. He sat with his hands loose in his lap and looked at the window, where the light was going fast now, the last of it turning the glass the color of creek water in shade. She rose and took her plate to the basin. He said, "Sit." She stopped. he said. "You cooked it." She stood a moment at the edge of something she did not have a word for. Then she brought her plate back and sat, and he got up and took his own plate to the basin, and then he came back and took the boy's without the boy asking, which made the boy look up with an expression she was careful not to see too directly. The boy put the lid back on the honey jar. He turned it once in his hands, then set it near the edge of the table, not back in the center, but not pushed away either. Some middle ground he'd arrived at without thinking. She reached past him and moved it back to where it could be reached by anyone. The boy watched her do this. Outside, something had loosened in the wind. It moved through the gap under the door now, a thin, cold thread along the floor, and the candle on the shelf shifted again. She had not asked about the candle. She had moved it from the windowsill that morning because it seemed it should not be so exposed, and she had put it on the shelf because that was a practical place for a candle, and she had lit it before the meal without ceremony because the light was going, and they needed light. She did not know yet that it had been there since the winter, that it had been lit every evening since then by someone who was no longer at the table. The boy was looking at it now, his hands still on the honey jar, his face arranged into something carefully neutral. She noticed the boy looking at the candle. She did not follow his gaze directly. She had learned, in the weeks before this, that children will close like a hand if you look too directly at what they're feeling. So she kept her eyes on the bread she was slicing, and she let him look. He looked for a long time. His father had gone still. Too, the way a man goes still when something he has learned to carry has been set down in front of him without warning. His hands were flat on the table, not tense, just present. The kind of stillness that comes from practice. She set the bread on the board and sat down. For a moment there was only the sound of the wind finding the gap under the door, and the small movement of the candle flame, and somewhere outside the livery, a horse shifting its weight. Then the boy said quietly, without looking away from the candle, "She lit it every night." His father said nothing. The boy's voice had been factual, not broken. The way children state things they have been carrying alone, because no one thought to say them out loud first. She did not look at the man. She looked at the boy. "Before supper?" she asked. He nodded. She said it kept the dark from coming in too fast. She considered this. The bread was still on the board. The soup had gone slightly past its best heat, but that did not matter now. She looked at the candle on the shelf, the way it sat in its holder, the wax worn low and uneven, the holder itself a plain tin thing that had been handled many times. "That's a good reason for a candle," she said. The boy finally looked at her, not with suspicion, with something more careful than suspicion. "You put it on the shelf," he said. "The windowsill lets the cold in around the frame," she said. "It would have guttered out all winter." He thought about this. The logic of it settled over him visibly, the way practical explanations do with children who are looking for a reason to accept something. "She didn't know about the draft," he said, not as an accusation, as a fact he was offering. "She picked the prettiest spot," she said. "That's not wrong." Something shifted in the boy's face then, small and quick, gone before it fully arrived. He looked back at the candle. His father had not moved. His hands were still flat on the table, and he was looking at the space between his plate and the breadboard. And she thought, without turning toward him, that he was not going to say anything for a while, and that this was all right. Some things did not need to be spoken into. Some things only needed to not be driven away. She reached for the bread and put a piece on the boy's plate. The boy ate the bread, not all of it. He tore a piece from the corner and chewed it slowly, watching the candle the way children watch fires, not for warmth, just for the movement of it. But he ate, and that was something. She cut the pork into portions and set them out without ceremony. The gravy had thickened the way she'd wanted it to, dark and plain, with the onion cooked down to almost nothing. She'd learned a long time ago that people who were not eating well didn't need food that announced itself. They needed something that tasted like it had always been there. His father served himself last. She noticed that. The way he waited until both plates were filled before he reached for the dish. Some habits came from courtesy, and some came from living alone with a child, for long enough that you stopped remembering you were also a person who needed feeding. She couldn't tell which this was. Maybe both. The fire in the stove had settled into a low, even burn. Outside the window, the sky had gone the color of iron, and the first edge of real cold was pressing against the glass. The candle on the shelf held its flame steady, not perfectly still. There was something in the house that moved the air a little, the way all lived-in houses do, the small shifts of breath and draft that a building absorbs over years. But steady enough. She ate. This was the part she had not known how to prepare for in the days before she came. The sitting down. The being seen at a table by people who did not yet know what kind of person she was. She had imagined it wrong, she realized. She had imagined it as something she would need to perform her way through. Some version of herself that was more certain and more easy than the actual version. But the boy was looking at the candle, and the man was eating, quietly, with the particular focus of someone who has not had a meal that tasted like anything in a while, and is not ready to say so. And she was just a woman at a table in a cold November, with her hands around a fork and the smell of pork gravy in the room, and nobody was asking her to be anything other than present. She reached for her water glass. The boy said, without looking away from the candle, "Is there more bread?" Not a question, quite. The way children speak when they want something and have not yet decided whether they are allowed to want it. She passed him the board. He tore another piece, ate it. His shoulders were a fraction lower than they had been when they sat down. She did not look at his father to see if he had noticed. Some things you registered alone, quietly, and kept. The candle gave a small flutter and righted itself. The boy ate 2 more pieces of bread before he set the last crust down on the edge of his plate, with the deliberateness of someone deciding something. She watched him without watching him. The way you learn to observe a wild thing, not directly, not with any pressure in the attention, just with the corner of your awareness held open and still. He looked at the dish of potatoes, then at her. "Can I have more of those?" She passed them without ceremony. He served himself, more than she expected for a boy his size, and she said nothing about it, and neither did his father, and the boy seemed to take some private measure of that silence and find it acceptable. The man refilled his own plate once. He did it quietly, the way he did most things, without announcing it or looking to see if she had noticed. She had noticed. She always noticed more than was useful to her. Outside the window, the dark had settled fully into the street. The lamp in the front room threw a low orange bar across the floor from under the door. The candle between them had burned down a quarter of an inch since they sat down. Small things. She was cataloging them without meaning to, the way you catalog things when you are not yet sure if a place is going to hold. She had lived in 4 towns in 6 years. She knew the specific texture of a place that would not keep her, and a place that might. She did not know yet what this was. After a while, the boy pushed his plate slightly forward. Not away, just forward. That half-inch of declaration. That means I am finished, and I would like that to be acknowledged. His father looked at the plate, then at the boy. Good. 1 word. But the boy sat up a fraction of an inch. She began to gather the dishes. The man stood, and she expected him to move toward the door, toward the porch, toward the particular solitude that was his habit in the evenings. She had been here only 3 weeks, but habits announce themselves quickly in small houses. Instead, he carried his own plate to the basin, set it in, stood there a moment with his hand flat on the counter. Then he said, without turning around, the gravy was good. She was holding 2 plates and a serving dish, and the kitchen was not large, and he was standing not 3 feet from her, and she understood without any ambiguity that it had cost him something to say that. Not much, maybe, but something. She set the dishes in the basin beside his. Thank you, she said. Neither of them moved for a moment. The boy was still at the table, turning the bread crust in his fingers, not watching them, or watching them the way children watch things they are pretending not to care about. She moved first, reached past him for the kettle and poured water into the basin, and the steam came up between them, and she stepped back to give him room to pass if he wanted to. He didn't pass. He stood there another moment, his hand still resting on the counter edge. I'll fix the hinge on the root cellar tomorrow, he said. It's been sticking. She nodded. I noticed. She had. She had nearly wrenched it that morning going for the canned tomatoes and had said nothing about it. The way she said nothing about most things. Because 3 weeks was not long enough to have opinions about a man's property. He moved toward the door then, paused at the threshold. The boy had gotten up from the table and was standing in that loose-limbed way children stand when they are hoping to be included in something, without having to ask. The man looked at him. Come on, then. And just like that, the boy was out the door behind him, into the last of the evening light. She stood in the kitchen and listened to their boots on the porch steps. 2 sets, one heavier than the other. She heard them move around the side of the house toward the barn, their voices low and indistinct. Not words, just the sound of 2 people talking about nothing in particular, which was its own kind of thing. She finished the dishes. The kitchen settled around her, the way kitchens do after a meal, the warmth still present in the walls, the smell of food and wood smoke, the particular quiet that is different from empty quiet. She dried her hands on the cloth by the basin and stood for a moment at the window. Outside, the light had gone blue and soft. She could see the edge of the barn, the pale fence posts running out toward the field. She did not feel at home. She was honest enough with herself to know that. 3 weeks was not home, but she felt something. She tried to name it and couldn't, and finally let it alone. On the shelf above the basin sat the blue tin she had noticed her first morning, the one with the dent in the lid, the one that held the salt. She had used it every day since and never mentioned it, and it had never been moved. and she had come to think of it as a kind of fixed point in this kitchen she was still learning. She reached up and straightened it slightly on the shelf. It had been sitting at an angle. She wasn't sure why she did that, only that it seemed like the right thing. She blew out the lamp on the table and left the one by the door burning for when they came back in. They came back in just after dark, the boy ahead, mud on his boots, talking before he'd even cleared the door about a rabbit he'd seen at the edge of the field. A big one, he said, just sitting there. His father followed him in, pulling the door shut behind him against the cold that had started to come in the evenings now. Early, without much warning. She had the pot still warm on the iron. There was bread from the afternoon, and the last of the preserves she'd put up from what she'd found in the cellar. Someone else's work, older fruit, but good still. They sat. The boy was still talking about the rabbit. His father poured the water. It was ordinary. She understood that. And yet something in the ordinariness felt different tonight. Or she felt different inside it. Less like a person watching a household from just outside the glass, more like someone who had been standing inside it long enough that the glass was no longer there. She sat down. The boy had stopped talking about the rabbit and was eating, and his father was eating, and she picked up her spoon and did the same. Halfway through the meal, the boy looked up at her. "Is there more bread?" he said. She passed it without comment. He took a piece and put it down, and then said, matter-of-factly, the way children said things that were not small, "This is better than the other bread." His father did not look up. She said, "Thank you." The boy went back to eating. His father reached for the bread next, broke a piece, and did not say anything either. But he did not have to. She had learned by now what his silences held and what they didn't, and this one was not empty. After, the boy was sent to wash, and she cleared the table. She heard his father's chair push back and thought he would go to the front room the way he usually did, but instead he stood there for a moment. She did not turn around. Then he said, "He doesn't say things he doesn't mean." She stopped, kept her hands on the bowl. "I know," she said. Another moment passed. She heard him move toward the front room and then stop again in the doorway. "The salt in this area runs to bitter," he said. "Whatever you've been doing to manage it, it's working." She turned then, but he was already half through the doorway, his back to her. She watched him go. The lamp by the door threw his shadow long across the floor, and then he was gone into the dark of the front room, and she stood there a moment longer before she went back to the dishes. That night she lay awake and listened to the house settle. The boy's breathing came through the wall, steady and slow, the sound of someone who had nowhere left to fall. Outside, the wind had picked up from the north, and the window frame gave its small complaint against the cold. She watched the dark ceiling and thought about what the man had said. Not the words themselves so much as the way he had stood there after saying them. Turned partly away, his voice level, offering something he had not rehearsed. She had been given compliments before. Bright, pretty things, weightless as cottonwood floss. This had not been that. She turned on her side and let her eyes close. In the morning, he was gone before she came down, the way he always was, but the fire had been built up and the water bucket filled. She stood at the stove and registered this the way she registered everything here, without comment, without surprise, just a small, steady addition to what she knew. The boy came down and ate his porridge. He had taken to sitting on the near side of the table now, where he could see the door and the window both, and she had noticed, but said nothing. Some adjustments did not need remarking on. He was nearly done when he set his spoon down and looked at the middle of the table for a moment. "My father used to eat standing up," he said. She waited. "After my mother died, he'd just stand at the counter." He picked the spoon up again, turned it. "He didn't do that this week." She looked at the bowl in her hands, then set it down. Outside the window, the light was pale and even, the sky carrying weather somewhere behind it, not arrived yet. "People find their way back to the table," she said. "Sometimes it just takes time." He seemed to consider that. Then he nodded once, his father's gesture compact and conclusive, and finished his porridge. She spent the morning on mending. There was a tear in the knee of the boy's good trousers, and she worked at it by the front window, where the light was better, the needle pulling through in small, even stitches. The basket sat beside her chair, the one she'd brought in her single trunk, the one her own mother had used. The leather handle was dark with years of hands. She did not think about what came next. There was enough in what was already here. The sound of the boy in the yard, the weight of cloth in her hands, the smell of wood smoke, the particular quality of light in this place she had not yet learned to name. She pulled the thread taut, held it. The boy came in at midday with mud on his boots and something held carefully in both hands. A bird's nest, empty, fallen from somewhere. He set it on the table as though it mattered. She looked at it. The construction of the thing, dry grass and a little horsehair, wound tight enough to hold 3 small lives until they were ready to leave it. "Found it in the yard," he said. "It did its job," she said. He considered this. Then he sat down across from her and looked at the nest for a while, the way he had learned to look at things. That quiet attention she recognized now as his father's, inherited or learned, she couldn't tell which. She set his lunch in front of him and went back to her chair. He came in from the field before the light changed. She heard his boots on the step, the loose board she had been meaning to mention, and then the door, and then the sound of him washing at the basin. She was at the stove. The bread was already on the table. There was a pot of beans with salt pork and a dish of pickled beets she had put up herself from the last of the garden, which was not yet hers, but which she was already learning. He sat. The boy sat. For a moment, the 3 of them were simply in the same room, the same light, the same quiet that had been here when she arrived, and would be here long after any of them were gone. She brought the pot to the table and sat down. He reached for the bread, cut it, passed half across to her before he took his own piece. It was a small thing, the smallest thing. She did not look up from her bowl. After supper, the boy fell asleep in his chair by the fire, the bird's nest still on the table, and neither of them moved to wake him. She cleared the dishes. He sat with his hands flat on his knees, watching the fire in the way he had, not restless, not waiting for anything, simply present. She set the last bowl on the shelf and turned back toward the room. The candle on the sill had burned low. Outside, the weather that had been gathering all day had finally arrived. A soft, steady rain against the glass, the kind that settles a place rather than disturbs it. She came back to the table and sat. He did not turn from the fire, but after a moment his hand moved across the wood between them and stopped. Open. Close enough. She looked at it. Then she set her hand beside his, and they sat there in the ordinary dark while the rain came down and the boy slept and the candle burned to nothing on the sill.